Hi. So for this video, I'd like to just introduce a couple of basic concepts that will be relevant for the subsequent videos when we start to dive into theories of the self. Um, so let's start with looking at the way that psychology looks at the self and contrast that with how sociology looks at the self. The reason why it's important that we do this is we're about to dive into a number of sociological theories on self. And the problem is, of course, that most people come to this topic in an intro to sociology class without a really sufficient background in sociology. And so when you sort of bump up against a concept that is unknown to you or a new way of looking at something that you've spent a fairly decent amount of time in your life becoming familiar with, which is the self, you're going to fall back on the way that you've been taught in the culture generally to think about and understand the self. And that, unfortunately for us in the United States, is a psychological, or at least a primarily psychological view of the self. It's not to say that the psychological view of the self is wrong. I want to be very clear about that. What I'm saying is that the psychological view of the self is not sociological. And so in a sociology class, if you are trying to apply a psychological lens to understanding this social concept, you're going to end up in error. So I'm going to go through four broad shared features that sort of characterize the psychological view of the self, and then I'm going to give you four broad sort of views that characterize sociological views of the self. And then I'm going to ask you, at least for the purposes of this class, to just sort of forget the psychology stuff, right? I'm putting it out there just so we have something to push off from. But if you are asked a question on the test, none of the things that I'm telling you about the psychological view of the self are going to be on the test. If you are having a conversation with somebody about how sociology looks at the self, none of the things that you see in this sort of psychological model of the self will be relevant. So that's very, very important to kind of keep in mind. All right, so I'm going to present it to you, and then of course, as I said, I'm going to ask you to forget it, which feels a little weird, but nevertheless, I hope you see the point. All right, so in psychology, it is fair to say that there's a broad tendency to see the self as a private possession, right? The self is a thing that people have. Um, for the record, both sociology and psychology agree, and that's pretty notable. Both sociology and psychology agree that we are not born with selves, right? Selves develop over time as human organisms interact with their environments. Right, both sociology and psychology agree that the self emerges through that process of socialization. So it's notable when we do agree that the term for this, by the way, if you've ever heard the term tabula rasa, that's what that means. It means we're born blank slates. And over time, society and our experiences kind of write on us, and we become, filled with the things that make us, for lack of a better word. But that thing, the self, in the eyes of psychologists, is a thing that belongs to you. It's a feature of individual organisms. It's a thing that adheres to a specific individual. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing to remember about the psychological view of the self is that it's relatively stable, right? That the self is established in childhood. Again, not something we're born with, but something that gets kind of built. And it is built mainly in childhood. And then for many, many psychologists, the self just kind of stops there, right? That whatever was built in childhood becomes sort of the foundation for everything that you become later in life. And this is, I think, revealed in the broad patterns and practices of clinical psychology. When you go to see a counselor, when you go to see a therapist to talk about some strategies for coping with some of the things in your life that you don't feel like you're able to cope with, or fears or anxieties or neuroses, many of them would sit down and sort of intentionally talk you back into the experiences you had as a child, because the understanding, at least again in the psychological view of the self, is that whatever self you have now as an adult, because it was established in childhood, if there is a problem with the self, it's going to be found there. Right, so the theories kind of say this, and the clinical practices of psychology sort of say this. And again, the idea is that the self, in addition to being something that is a feature of individual organisms, is also something that is relatively stable. Right, it doesn't change very much over time. The third feature of the psychological view of the self is that it is rooted in, and as a result of that, reflects one's personality. So the self that people encounter when they interact with you is a reflection of your sort of personality and your disposition. Now, this assumes that that there's a kind of stability or kind of long-term durability of the of one's personality, and I think that that's something certainly that we can push back against, but nevertheless, it is a cornerstone of a lot of psychological perspective on the self. And finally, the self plays an integral role in our motivation, our cognition, our affect, and our identity. Again, right, the things about us that people and that to a certain extent that psychologists sort of take an interest in are kind of driven by or organized around one's self and one's personality, which are kind of very, very kind of interconnected. All right, so I suspect that probably looks pretty familiar to most of you. Many of you have had psychology classes. Almost all of you, I suspect, have been raised or socialized in a society that tends to use a broad sort of psychological perspective on talking about and understanding and coping with things related to the self. Which is why the sociological perspective on this is so hard for some people to grasp, because it really is very, very different. It's very distinct. So what is it made up of? What does it look like? Well, I'm going to give you 4 features, and they all, to some degree or another, push off against the corresponding feature on the psychological side of the equation. Now, I want to be clear. Sometimes you will see this described as the sociological view of the self. Sometimes you will see it described as the social psychological view of the self. Sometimes, pretty rarely, but sometimes you may even see it described as the symbolic interactionist perspective on the self. I think that's pretty rare, because symbolic interaction is a very explicit and sort of narrowly defined theoretical paradigm. But nevertheless, sometimes those terms get used interchangeably. If you see social psychological or symbolic interactionist, it's just the sociological view of the self. All right, so first, and in direct contradiction to the first point in the psychological view of the self, sociology views the self as a fundamentally social phenomenon, not a thing that we have, but a thing that we do. Now, that's maybe not so hard to kind of conceptualize, but I'm going to put it out there for a second. I'll elaborate a little bit. Although, again, all these subsequent videos that you're going to go through for the next week will all sort of acknowledge this in some way or the other. The self is social in, I think, 2 ways. One, of course, it emerges through and is developed through social processes, right? So its very origins are in interactions. That's where selves come from. Those are the forces and processes that shape what the self looks like. So it is explicitly social in that regard. It is also social in where and how and when it plays out. Right? The self always unfolds and is always a social phenomenon in social environments. So thinking about the self as this thing that's kind of squirreled away inside a person's mind really becomes problematic. But if you think about the self as a thing that sort of gets displayed or gets altered by or has significant impact and consequences on interaction, then you can begin to see the way in which the sociological focus is always going to be on that aspect of the self, not denying any internal state, but rather focusing on the fact that whatever the internal state is, it's the external manifestation of the self that's really of consequence. That brings us into looking at the things that are going on around the self, the things that were happening as the self was developing, and all of that. So that's the first thing. The self is a fundamentally social phenomenon. It is a thing that we do. Number two, the self is fluid and changes. It changes across our lifetimes. It changes across social settings. The self I am when I am in interaction with my students is different than the self I am when I am interacting with my colleagues, is different than the self I am when I'm at a Cubs game, is different than the self I am when I'm in somebody's funeral or wedding ceremony, right? So I am many different selves. And the self that I am in a particular moment is going to be a function of the third feature, which is the degree to which the self is rooted in context, right? So the third feature of the sociological view of the self is that the self is rooted in and thus reflects context. The things that I do and say in the classroom, I do and say because I'm in the classroom, in the presence of students, while class is in session. If the students all got up and walked out, even though class had not yet come to an end, my behavior would change as a result of that. Or even if it stayed the same, even if I stood at the front of the classroom continuing to deliver a lecture to an empty room, I am no longer a teacher. Right? To be a teacher, I am defined by students. And in the absence of students, I can't be a teacher any more than students can be students in the absence of an instructor. Right? So that's really, really important to look at those relationships. And relationships are always embedded in context. So the things that are expected of you, the behaviors, the moods, the tendencies or dispositions are going to be driven by who you are and where you are and who you're with. Those elements of context that have the greatest amount of impact on us in interpersonal contexts. So that's the third feature. And the fourth, and I'll admit this last one's going to sound a little bit radical. We will hopefully come to see, or you will hopefully come to see how it is clear. I already have a good sense of that, of course. But the fourth view that sociology takes of the self is that the self is external to us. It's not a thing that is attached to us, that selves in fact emerge or come into existence in the context of social interaction. That one, like I said, this is probably a little bit of a stretch if you've not made yourself familiar with how sociology looks at the self up to this point. But by the time we get done with the next 3 or 4 videos, hopefully this last point will make a little bit of sense to you. So I want to make one final point before I wrap this video up, and that is to look at the definition of self that we've been working with so far. So at the beginning of the semester, as you were sort of getting acquainted with the broad introductory materials and concepts that would kind of be important as you sort of started to learn to look at the world through a kind of sociological lens, I put a definition of self in play that was the relatively organized complex of attitudes, beliefs, values, and behaviors associated with an individual. That's been up to this point sort of the textbook definition of self. For those who are wondering, I just kind of randomly pulled that out of a Intro to Sociology textbook. I don't even remember which one, but they're all basically the same. If you look at this, right, and you kind of break it apart and you kind of look at the constituent parts of this definition, what you will see is a mostly psychological way of looking at the self. That's what's revealed in that definition. I bring that up to make the point that this psychological frame for looking at the self is so pervasive that even sociologists find themselves falling into that pattern. They find themselves falling into a tendency to think about and look at the self as a psychological phenomenon rather than a social phenomenon or sociological phenomenon. So we're going to abandon this definition, and I'm going to give you a few new ones over the next few videos. I will also ask you again to sort of now, at least for the next few weeks, forget the psychological view of the self. It's already kind of present in your head anyway, so you don't have to try to memorize all of this stuff because it kind of already aligns with the things you think you know about the self. So reject that and try to immerse yourself in and understand the self through this kind of sociological frame in which the self is a social phenomenon. It's fluid and it shifts and it changes. It's rooted in and is driven by the demands of context. And in many respects, it isn't even a phenomenon that exists at the individual level, but rather at the external social level, that selves arise in the context of interactions. If you can get even marginally comfortable with those four views, then the next several videos in which we dive into theories and concepts of the self, those things will be a little bit easier, I think, for you to grasp, analyze, and in many cases apply. All right, so buckle up your seatbelts. It gets a little weird at this point in the semester, but hopefully over the next, as I said, over the next week or so, I can make all of this as clear as possible. So I will just say, take care and I'll see you next time.